older, maybe.
Okay, it seems to have loaded. I'm recording, and now I'm going to share my screen so you can see what I'm doing.
Huh.
It's going to sound a little crappy in Skype, but the recording is going to be full audio quality.
Hmm.
Alright, can you see?
Yeah.
Sweet.
No, yeah, it's loading right now.
I got some zeros. Did they?
First, there was the collapse of civilization. Anarchy, genocide, starvation. Then when it seemed things couldn't get any worse, we got the plague. The living death, quickly closing its fist over the entire planet. And then we heard the rumors that the last scientists were working on a cure that would end the plague and restore the world. Restore it. Why? I like the death. I like the misery.
Okay.
I will say something about drums. I use the limiter to like Sanchini kick snares and I put everything on the one channel and then use the limiter. It's a bullshit. I usually use like separate kicks, separate snares. Here is everything was coming from one channel.
Mm.
And I think
Well, you know, it doesn't sound that bad as individual sounds, but I do see what you mean about the mix. So here's a question. Where in this did you start making it? Like, where did you begin this track?
I think from the beginning to drop, I think it's
Hmm.
beginning, yeah, and the drop it's like I think it's main things, yeah.
All right. In the future, I recommend that you begin with the drop.
To start doing from the drop, yeah, I started from the drop. I did drop and then I did the intro.
Okay. Does make things slightly easier when you do that. This is actually pretty okay together, depending like for what you did here, like with your side chaining and stuff like that. Let's see what this sounds like without this junk on. I see what you're doing. Okay, cool. All right. So mixing wise, it's actually a little bit easier to deal with it if you don't do a mix this good before your master.
Could you say one more time?
Yeah, the balance for tracks like this tends to work out better if you don't do a mix this good before your master. What I mean by good here is this. I have your master effects off right now, and
Mm-hmm.
the mix is relatively well put together. The drums and the bass.
Sorry, I will say one thing. Sorry, I put this on master, these things, only because I wanted to export this like MP3, and usually if you export, it sounds like very like low sound. I don't know why in headphones I don't hear anything. That's why I put the compressor and the volume was a little bit high. Usually I don't put anything on the master channel.
Mm.
This is a backup version of this track of this project because on the main or the on the iMac and on the main version um, I I wrote the everything where are kicks, all the channels were like underwritten what is there, but this is like backup version, and yeah, there is nothing. Sorry for that.
Oh, it's fine. I could figure out most of what's happening just fine. But sort of what I'm talking about is it's really difficult to take a mix that's like nice and leveled like this and master it in such a way that has the kind of weight that we're talking about with this stuff. Let me give you. Oh, we'll work on this one, but just real quick, I want to show you an example of what I'm talking about in a track that I'm working on. In here, yes, the one that says real. Happens to also be drum and bass.
Yeah, I see 174 BPM. It's usually drum and bass.
There might have been some logic as to why they chose that number originally, but it is the reality now. Do-do-do-do-do. So this track.
I know this track. I saw it on your YouTube channel, and I really wanted to ask after the lesson when you will complete this. I know it.
It's actually a little more closer to done than it was in the video version. I actually have a second drop now, but for the most part, this track has the kind of balance, like in a regular kind of. Oof, and I forgot that I turned down my buffer. Put that back. Anyway, what I wanted to show you was what this track sounds like without the mastering on. Like, just for reference, these two here, this is like the main bass, and then over here is kick and snare. And I just wanted to show that the kick and the snare are peaking a lot higher than everything else. So much so that without the mastering on, you can barely hear other stuff. And is this guy even doing anything? It's just here. And this is the sort of the way that I prefer to do stuff with the mixes like this, is to make a mix that is way over dynamic, and then using mastering to bring it back. Like this is what's going into the mastering right now. This signal, this wildly peaky, not very well kind of cut down thing, but with the purpose that we're gonna cut it down with the mastering, and then what's left is going to be that balance. In your track, I probably should kill this. In your track, well, your basses are actually louder than your drums.
Yeah.
Consider
Really, I just don't know how to make this like good compression for drums, and it's yeah. You need to explain how to do it like well. Yeah.
Sure. So on individual drums, like before we get to the whole like marrying them together thing, the best case scenario is that you find samples or a loop or something that already is what you want. And of course, if that's kind of rare. But generally speaking, like there's not so much like a thing that you always have to do. It's just a thing you do, like basically for damage control. Let's listen to your drums. We're gonna.
If you could find better drums for this.
This is like these are fine samples. Like they have the texture, like especially like the middle dudes. Like, that's perfectly fine. Like this halfway part, dude. Come on. Like that works out, and like you got the right idea with the extra hats and stuff over here. Like this is perfectly fine. I think the only thing I would do would change about the snare is just the high pass to lower frequencies, because you guys don't really need them.
I watch a lot of your videos, and you're usually doing this too. Yeah.
Yeah, And that isn't something I need to always do though. Like sometimes I'll have a sample that just is already doing that. And what version of FL are you using?
What you mean? What numbers? Yeah.
Yeah.
I need to check it. It's not like mine because it's like corporated. It's guys gave me the code. It's version 20.0 and 3.
Okay. I believe, yeah, so that means you can use Maximus, if you didn't know that. It's free.
Yeah, sure, I can.
Yeah. As opposed to this, the oldest compressor on Earth. I was going to say a thing. Oh, yeah. Especially in the beginning when you're newer and, like, it's harder to hear the changes and things, it's a little bit better to use things like at least the limiter so you can see what's happening. In terms of just like having that information, even if you don't totally know what to do with that, like it adds up to being stuff that helps you later. It's kind of a workflow thing. So let's listen to this in your basses. And you described to me an interesting sidechain profile. That's these dudes? Oh yeah, the whole thing. That's what you're doing. You're sidechaining the whole deal. That still can work fine. So what we're going to do, I'm just going to turn down your basses. What was this? More tonal stuff, how good you were doing that. And really, really high in the 500 range, I just kind of... I'm also going to do one of these. Up in the kick a lot. Cool. Now we're going to look at this in the master. And let's use a new limiter. Not even going to mess with Maximus. Because we want to see levels. So whenever I use the limiter, first thing I do is I turn this off just because this introduces real delay. And if you want to have less delay, you want to have it off, just in general. Okay. All right. Excuse me.
I'm also ill.
Yeah, thanks. Cold weather.
Yeah, but we have very cold weather today also.
So how much do you know about dynamic range and level and all that?
I think nothing.
Okay, so let's look at this signal.
Just a little bit. No, I know something.
So this is the thing coming into your master right now. And the basic goal that we want to have is we want to have these elements that are loud feel as loud and awesome as these elements, which are not loud, but can be. The kind of obvious answer is just like... And it makes it just a little bit better, but it's not super perfect. And it has to do with how fast the time variables are. Have you ever messed with these guys a lot?
No. Usually I used only the compression. The limiter I didn't use.
So
I mean in the limiter, you know, these two sections.
Right.
And this under. Yeah.
Sure. So how a compressor does its thing is that it's volume automation, and like you can see this white line basically telling you how it's doing its thing, and how crisp or muddy a compression sounds has to do largely with how fast it does its job, and that is determined by these parameters. So now all of a sudden, this signal is a lot crunchier and sausagier, and it is because the compression is actuating fast enough to make that a thing. That isn't so bad. this guy is being... Okay, so I'm not going to sidechain the sub by everything. I'm going to sidechain it by just the kick. I like this, but it probably had just a teensy bit too much reverb.
I like the misery. I like the misery.
Oh, that's this thing.
It's from the old, very old movie with Van Damme. It was in 18s.
Is that a Van Damme line?
Huh?
Is that one of his line?
I sorry, don't understand.
Van Damme, was that one of his lines?
Yeah.
This whole thing. Applicable.
I like the misery.
Oh, you have a second kick.
Yeah, maybe it's...
And it's going into the same channel. All right, so we can. I was gonna high pass this, but we can do that from a sampler.
okay.
Yeah, because we want the high. We want the hat that it does with it. But like this guy is basic enough on his own.
I like the misery.
Also into that. So this is the snare.
I like the misery.
Okay. Cool. So now we're starting to get that kind of tearing distortion feel, which happens when you compress stuff too fast, because at that point it's basically distortion. So you want to, how much you know about multi-band compression?
A little bit, just a little bit.
Just a little bit. Now we can start talking about Maximus.
Okay.
Yeef. All right. So the whole point of multi-band compression is the recognition. Oh wow, I just forgot English. We recognize that different areas of frequency have very different envelopes. Essentially, bass stuff is slow enough that not very slow compression will ruin it, because it'll be faster than it. But high frequency stuff gets ruined when it's too slow, when it's like muddy and flappy, because it's not doing it fast enough. So multi-band compression lets us have individual compressors that do individual jobs. And insofar as where the cuts go, turn on Maximus, jeez. You should do the thing. What I'm looking for here is the fundamental toning or snare, which I already know is 200 because we're looking at it. But we want it to be a little bit lower than that because these cuts aren't sharp. They're not like walls like this looks like it is. There's a bit of bleed. And we want the low end and the mid to kind of represent kick, snare, and everything else. No more limiter. Okay, so this is pretty much what we want to see when we're looking at separated bits of our track here. Like in the low end, we really only want to see kick and sub, and then we want to see like an identifiable like consistent level that the sub exists at, and then we want to see that the kick is higher than it.
Yeah.
In this case, it happens to be minus 6 dB, but that was totally unplanned. It just happened that way. And then same thing in the mids. We want to see the snares and stuff have bigger peaks than whatever material is going on in there, but they could be a little more varied because there's a lot more in there. And then higher frequencies are no man's land. They can do whatever they want. Don't worry about it. As long as you get these two dudes really nailed in, then the rest of it can survive just fine. So this is fine. I'm not going to touch it. I'm not going to do anything to it. I'm going to do a little bit to this guy, though. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to make it so that, like, essentially the peaks only go up to here, just because I'm, like, visually noting that there's, like, the add variations up here, and we're going to get rid of it just by making there be a line there as such.
Oh, okay.
You can see the line show up where it is there, just to be helpful. And then the outcome is that. A much more uniform, much more controllable signal that we can also turn up without causing destruction. I'm going to make it a little faster because it's mid-range and it can be that fast. And then in the highs, I'm going to do a little bit of specialness. I'm going to do kind of what we just did there, only instead of doing a limit, which is what this line would be, I'm going to let it open a bit, which is like having a bit of compression with a bit of ratio. And I'm also going to do this. This tension here is going to do that kind of pumping business where it'll kind of inflate it. I'll just do it. You see it pulling up stuff in there and leaving the rest of it there. That's kind of what we were going to do, but like lighter than that. Another thing I'm going to do is I'm going to use this control, which is a mid-side fader, to force the low end to be mono, which is on this side. And then I'm going to spread the stereo a bit on the mids and highs. You aren't really going to really be able to hear it right now because Skype transmits audio in mono, but the recording will have it. And now we're left with this on the master, where we can see the fairly active peaks that we have from our drums and then kind of the rest of the content. And now we're going to try our best to push it as hard as we can to be as loud as we can before it starts to sound bad. And there's a bit of a cheaty tool we can use in reference to the noisier stuff. Older noisier things were as loud as they were because they were literally clipping their master. And we're going to do that, but we're going to use modern technology. Distortion. So this guy, the soft saturation, is more interesting than what we're going to do with it. But what we're going to do is turn on the threshold just slightly to the side here so that it creates a very thin red line. And then that red line is going to be at 0 dB, which is the center default setting. And because this compression is open on the top, it's going to let some of the stuff go through above 0 dB, but it's going to encounter the soft saturation when it does. And that's going to kill it instantaneously, like distortion does. And this preserves impact and snap and that kind of thing. So you can see this version of the signal, it doesn't quite go all the way up there, but this one does. That feels a little bit better. Insofar as mixing this stuff. Here, let me render an MP3 of this real quick so you can hear it on your end.
Okay.
I'll just Control R, desktop.
After that, could you like send the project back also?
Sure.
Ah, okay, thanks. Which settings usually I need to put when I exporting the track from FL Studio?
Barely anything really. Like I have this resampling on, but that's just default. I usually just have it off. I'll talk about what that does, just so you know why in a second. There's an internal setting too that you'll want to care about, like while you're making the thing. Basically, none of this stuff matters unless you're doing unless you're like specifically rendering a loop or something designed to work in software that no one ever uses anymore. And as for bitrate and stuff like that, like it's up to you. And although when you do when you send a track to a label, when you go to do one, they'd always ask for it in 16-bit wave. So high quality stuff is not necessarily everyone's strong suit.
Okay.
That's just life.
I heard that I'm living in Estonia, and usually if you're sending something to the labels, they are doing mastering by themselves.
I mean, they will if they have to, but they don't want to. They a label will always prefer that like you can do as much of the stuff as you can by yourself. And that's not just music stuff. Like if you can do your own art, have your own like photos and stuff and logos and like as much of the release, like if you can plan all of your advertising by yourself, you will be like a label's best friend.
That is cool. I just heard that some Russian labels are doing this thing. No, the German-based labels. Whoa! I downloaded it so fast. Oh, I don't have the player. Okay, I will do it. 1 second. I already downloaded it.
Okay. And I'll save you this project. I'm not gonna need to send you the loop because you already, or the zip because you already have all the stuff. So I'm gonna send you the flip. Where the hell did it save it? Why would I save it in network shortcuts? That was okay.
Oh, I'm just listening. It sounds much better. Yeah. You know what I did? You send me back, yeah, this flip. Okay. Okay, you will continue, yeah?
Yep.
Okay, I'm listening.
All right. So insofar as render settings, the one thing that matters a little bit, and seemingly the way that you do things you'll want to care about, is the resampling quality. Do you know what aliasing is?
Not much. Just heard some words.
Cool.
Not many.
All right. So this actually could be a little primer as into how digital sampling works at all, because it's honestly pretty awesome. So when you record a given thing at a given sample rate, it creates sample points, where it's, in this case, 44.1 kilohertz, so 44.1 thousand times a second, it samples the audio and puts little samples in there to determine, how to make the thing work digitally. Now, the special thing about this is that it's actually fairly cool math to be able to determine the one signal that will work through all these points on this graph. And the trick that makes it work that way is a thing called band limiting, where it knows that there's, at any given sample rate, you can create one frequency that's the highest possible frequency, and it's half the sample rate. So 44.1, the highest frequency you can make is 22.5 kilohertz high. Well outside the range of human hearing, which is why we tend to like this frequency and sample rating. And the math knows that you aren't going to make anything that's higher than that particular value. So when you see like a kind of a sharp sampling event, and then there's bits of the sample, bits of the curve that seemingly are outside of the points in such a way that how could it possibly have known to make that curve? Like when it makes actual oscillations between samples. And it can do that because it knows that anything else it would have done would have created frequencies that are higher than what's called the Nyquist frequency. The guy named Nyquist came up with it, the half the sample rate thing. And though you can still try to create a frequency that's higher than that, you can just generate it. Like saw waves are pretty high frequency. At the highest frequency, you just turn a high enough pitch, and you've got frequencies way above Nyquist. Yeah. And when that happens, it aliases. And what this means is that instead of it just going away, it wraps around and comes back down. So if 22.5 kilohertz was the highest frequency, and then I made a 32.5 kilohertz sound, it actually would show up 10 kilohertz lower in the frequency spectrum because of that, which is aliasing, and it sounds really bad most of the time. Typically, we don't tend to worry about this when we're making things because lots of plugins, like Serum, for example, has internal anti-aliasing where it puts a giant, like, really sharp filter way up there so that it doesn't have this problem. Citrus gets away with it with an internal band limiting where anytime you press a note, it's creating a sound that just isn't playing harmonics that high. And something like Harmor, which is additive synthesis, and it just never creates a frequency that high. But when it does, like when you have recorded content, like an audio file or a hi-hat, and you pitch it up, that creates aliasing. And FL's internal anti-aliasing is the resampling quality. This whole option right here. And this only applies to audio. So like when you have like white noise and stuff, you turn it up and then it aliases. This is what makes it anti-alias. By default, it's on 24-point sync, I think, and I turn it off. I just keep it off the whole time. Reason for that is A, it uses more CPU the more amount you're doing it, and B, I just want to hear what the stuff sounds like naked anyway.
Okay.
And then, when you go to render, at all, you again have this resampling quality, and this again only applies to audio, the resampled audio. Though, if you render this at a different setting, it will make things sound different. And it might not always be obvious as to what it did, because if it's removing aliasing that you couldn't tell was there, you will have just accepted that as part of your texture. And then if it's gone all of a sudden, that'll be the first time you've heard of it. So I tend to keep this to mirror whatever setting is going on in my option. Same thing with high quality for plugins. This is when it starts to care about stuff for individual plugins. I don't think it does anything to third-party stuff like Serum. But, for example, Citrus has this here, has high quality and oversampling, which is the aliasing solution for this plugin. And it has a draft and a render setting. Because, again, this uses extra CPU, so it's saying that it will render it. Oh. Hello? Testing. Oh, snap. Hello?
Yeah.
I don't know what that was about.
Yeah.
Whoops.
Sometimes it's happening. It's fine.
It, like, closed me out of Skype.
Oh.
It was weird. Anyway, what was the last thing you heard me say?
Could you open make the last stream, yeah. And I will say, yes, about the quality, you put the oversampling and...
Yeah. So that menu item in the render option, the high quality for all plugins, make sure that this thing is a thing. A lot different plugins also have different options, like inside FL, but for the most part, it's just draft and render for these guys, and like it'll have built-in business like that. Important for FM because FM is very easily creates frequencies wildly outside of Nyquist. Same thing for distortion. Like the Wave Shaper has a built-in oversampling option too, since distortion is all about multiplying harmonics, and it can multiply it way outside of Nyquist. Get rid of that.
Okay.
But yeah, that's a quick description of what those settings do.
Yeah.
Yeah. Did you have any questions about that?
No. If I have questions, I could just watch the video again.
Neat.
Right now it's fine. I remember.
So what do you think about this version of your track?
It's much better. Sounds much better. And yeah, I understand now about kicks and snares. At the beginning, it was. One more thing. If I export this project like MP3, usually if I do so, why the sounds quality, not the quality, a volume is very low?
It just sounds like the playback and whatever you're listening to it on isn't turned up enough.
No, yeah, because I don't know why. Usually, if I'm, let's for example, why I'm so stupid. Okay, just let's I will try take some tracks from the internet, and I will take the track which I exported, and I think the track from the internet, like let's say from the Apple Music, it will be louder 30%. Yeah.
Well, some of that is um, kind of ethereal stuff, like how the mastering is. Like you can have a track that peaks at the same level and still be louder.
Uh, okay, so simple.
And that's typically what most people talk about when they think that when they hear like a quote unquote pro track and they're going, "Oh my god, it's so much louder than mine." And I mean usually that's what's happening is that like it's mastered in such a way that it is louder and it's not literally like your file is for some reason too quiet.
Uh,
For example,
okay.
I rendered this out and I hadn't heard a MP3. Let me go listen to it real quick just to make sure.
Yeah.
Play the thing. Yeah, that's the same level.
Yeah. Same.
Yep.
Okay.
So I think you're just keying into mastering differences.
Okay. Okay. No problem. So, uh, what can I ask you? Mm. Ah, maybe I will check maybe as one more project. Maybe this same. I need to log in to studio. 1 second.
No problem. You have a pretty good idea about how to arrange this stuff, which is nice. Like you got the detail work in there, which a lot of people tend to miss when trying.
Thank you. I just spent so many time in the FL Studio to learn how to make it. Yeah, but uh, from the childhood, uh, I like I when I was very young, let's say 4 or 5 years, I was always singing and doing all this and that stuff with music. Try every instrument, and after like 13 years old, I just like stopped because the school, all this stuff, I just don't have time. And now I have free time. I like came back to the music, and now I don't know. It's very simple to create something. Like I know the rhythmics. I heard the sounds. It's like I have this like I can hear the sounds. Yeah, let's say simply. It's not hard. I know a little bit the notes. Yeah,
Mm,
music notes. I mean.
sure.
Yeah, I can hear. I don't know the note grammatic, but like I hear what is like okay, what is wrong. Yeah. Oh, I checked already 5 projects and can find. I hope it. No, this is this one. I usually have the numbers everywhere, and then going to like now checking like all the numbers, and then it can find what the fuck usually.
I definitely have like so many hundreds of lost projects and folders and hard drives and places I can't find anymore.
Yeah, it's the same thing, same thing. I have over the 1,000 projects, and I don't know where they hard drive, maybe some other hard drives, and where they, I don't know. Yeah, I found. Export, save, see, desktop, save. Oh, it's so fast in this PC. No. I will drag and drop. 1 second.
Hey,
Oh, it's quite heavy.
it should be okay.
Okay. No, heavier than the previous one.
Mm.
And could you do the same thing just one more time and just listen this? Is it fine or not? This project, it's my, I think, two favorite projects.
Sure thing. I am downloading.
Yeah, and I started like how in English will be like creating music, writing a music. How it I say that I'm a music creator. How to say that I'm creating the music.
You're a producer.
Okay, producer. What I'm doing, producing.
Yep.
Okay.
A musician is someone who plays an instrument. A songwriter is someone who writes lyrics. And a producer is someone who does everything.
Okay.
This is actually a way better mix than the other one.
Yeah, because here I used here's less sounds, and I used the new headphones on this project.
Well, good. I guess they had a positive impact after all.
Yeah.
This basically has the right like layering of like levels with kicks and things. Like they're actually louder than the bass considerably, and I'm willing to bet that created a decent profile into your master. Stop giving me options to show me anything. Yeah, just with the exception that this is a little slow. And this is the default limiter, right? Like, it shows up, that, yeah. Yeah, that's the difference between the time variable speed right there. In the previous time, when that ramp showed up, it was too much level, and it got whippy and muddy. But then when you made it, if you make it faster, it is fast enough that it maintains sharpness throughout the whole time.
Okay. Yeah.
And it feels less like everything's being disrupted by everything else. And this sort of merging of the hard things you did with this kick and snare actually worked out pretty well for this track because the samples were better.
Oh, okay. I usually, usually how long it's take you for you to create like a track? No, let's say the drop. Yeah.
I don't know. That kind of varies. Like,
yeah, I know it's various. No, it maybe like something in the middle. Usually, how long it takes for you?
I mean, creating the drop concept is like could take me like as long as an hour, but then like the rest of the track takes like 30.
Yeah. For me, I'm choosing only the samples, only for 1 hour. I don't know. I'm trying to maybe find something fine with will sounds fine with other instruments, and I don't know why it takes so much time for me, especially for this track.
Well, you did pretty good for just the 2.5 hours that's logged on this track, on this particular project. And like, although if you do just list out the stuff that you do to make a song, like pick samples, pick sounds, put them together, mix them together, it doesn't sound very complicated. And ultimately, it's because it isn't. And it's because until you do this stuff, you just have none of the words and none of the experience. But then when you get there, you just kind of like, oh.
I forgot what I wanted to say. I usually try to create all the baseline by myself. I did this baseline, I think, by myself, or maybe I found the nice preset. I know here is the preset. I changed it a little bit, maybe. But usually I'm trying to create like my own baseline, what I like, and then the drums. I don't care about them because it's so many samples which I could use. It's just, I think it's a waste of time to create our own drums.
It's a reasonable way to think. It's true that like just about there are enough packs out there that there exists somewhere a pack of drums that is already exactly what you want, way better than you could ever have done it yourself, and that's true for me. Like that's true for anybody. It's because samples are a way of life now.
Right now, you want to say that these projects like sounds fine, yeah?
It sounds better than the other dude, and it does also sound fine largely because it's sparse. There's
What the sparse means?
there's not a lot happening.
Uh,
It's got enough room for the individual sounds that it's not difficult to mix them together, which is true. And as I mean, also it works. This is fine. This is a decent down tempo. I was actually just thinking to myself, if this track existed in 2007, it would have blown minds.
okay. We have 7 minutes, yeah?
Mhm.
Okay. If it's not hard, could you no mix down here also?
Yeah, why not? Fine. Too much low end.
You could
Various
change
effects
as
and
you want.
things. Yeah. I'm just so fun thing. You can actually do the soft saturation trick with the limiter too, because that's what this knob does.
Uh,
And if you turn it on just a little bit so that it's on without actually moving it, you get the same red line. And then you just turn the ceiling up so that it's still limiting it above 0 dB, but not enough to like what we're doing with the Maximus.
okay.
Yeah, that sounded pretty good. So that was light touch, really. Like not a lot had to happen to this. I didn't even use this other compressor, and I don't even need to use Maximus because. So I tell this to a lot of my students actually that arrangement and sample choice are as much your mixing as is also your mixing and mastering. Like your decision to only play so many things together is part of what makes it like a mixable thing. And also another concept that comes hard for newer producers is the idea of fills, using lots of toms and crazy tom fills like against stuff in like at the ends of songs and things. And they're hard to mix against other elements as good as we mix things like kicks and snares. And
Yeah.
if you look at a lot of the coolest sounding fills you can remember and the coolest tracks you can remember, you'll discover that they just don't play things against the fills. The basses stop, the sub stops, and then the fill happens, and then the rest of the track happens. It's because the fills are so hard to mix against stuff that they just don't. And that's part of the arrangement choice affecting your mixing by just choosing not to have so much stuff happen together. Versus if you wanted to go really hard, there's on the dubstep side of things, people like Seven Lions who only layer everything together, inviting mixing suffering onto yourself.
Okay.
Yeah, we'll save this guy.
Yeah. So, could you say yeah? Send me this project back also.
No problemo. 26.
Do you know the podcast? It's a Neuropank podcast. It's from Russian DJ. His nickname is like
Nope, never heard of it.
No,
Should link me though.
you never heard about this podcast?
No, I don't really listen to a lot of that stuff.
Oh, really? It's just the most popular drum and bass podcast in the world.
Is it?
Yeah.
Well, shit. I'll go listen to it then.
Yeah, yeah. I started listening. It's maybe 10 years ago. Yeah, when it was very old, and now when I checking, it's on the SoundCloud and other sources. It's always have a lot of like playbacks. Yeah, a lot of people are listening it, and a lot of artists from this podcast noise are taking their jobs to own podcasts. If you want to hear the like cool drum and bass, it's a Russian podcast. It's from Russia, and it's very cool. If you want to hear the cool drum and bass, you could check this podcast. Very cool.
All right, I think I will do that.
It's one of the best drum and bass.
Well, I do want to hear some new Neuro, so that's a good place to start.
Yeah. Have 2 minutes. Maybe what else I can ask you? Well, yeah. Usually, as I know, the producers, no, my friends maybe, they're usually not mixing down by themselves. They're sending projects. Someone will like mix down and do the mastering for the track. And do you like provide like this thing so I can like send you project, pay you, and you will send it back?
That's not something I've done a lot of, but yeah, if you want it, we can. It's not difficult.
Okay. Usually one track with mixing down and mastering. How much is it in dollars?
Well, let's say if it's stuff like this, we can call it $40 a track.
Oh, $40.
Yeah, I'm not exactly a mixing and mastering house, so I'm not gonna demand $10,000 for some track.
Yeah, because here in Europe, I asked one. I was communicating with a guy. His name, I don't know how to pronounce his name. I typed in Skype. It's Ham. Yeah, this guy from Poland. And he did mixing down and mastering for 30 euros. I think it's the same, like $40. Yeah, the same price.
Oh, well, that's cool.
But in my country, I'm from Estonia, and here, if you will ask some guys from the studios to mix down your track, they will say, "Oh, $100. It's fine." Oh, not dollars, euros.
It's funny. You're actually I think the third Estonian student I've had.
Really?
Yeah.
No, I will say I'm 30% Estonian and 70% Russian. Yeah.
Oh, cool beans.
Yeah. Like I know let's say that I know 2 languages and English also. I can learn it.
You do a lot better English than some of the actual Russian students I've had, so good job.
Thank you. It's because my parents sent me to in the kindergarten in the English group, and maybe because of that, I don't have like the big accent, accent. Yeah.
Well, you definitely do a good job. You should thank your parents someday for that.
Yeah, I already said 1,000 times. It's very good that they did this, because they, like in Soviet Union, they said we didn't learn it, but right now we know it. It's like very, how to say, important to know English. Yeah, if you know English, you can travel everywhere except China. I was there. People don't know English at all.
Never been to China myself.
You've been there?
Nope.
No. Just know that usually they don't know English.
Good advice.
Yeah. Okay, Seamless, thank you very much.
No problem. I'll upload this video onto YouTube and I'll get you a link where it'll be in a minute.
Okay. No. I can't download it from there. I will use some services to download it. Okay, no problem. I hope I can. Yeah, it's no problem if I will download it.
Yeah, just easier for me upload-wise, because otherwise I would send a several hundred megabyte file through Skype. It's not going to work.
Yeah, I no problem.
Sweet.
Again, thank you very much. And if I want to buy the like mixing down and mastering for where I need to write to Skype, Gmail.
Yeah, hit me up on my Gmail.
Okay, no problem.
And,
Okay.
all right then. Please have a fine rest of your day.
Okay, where I have, I will go to sleep in an hour.
All right. Well, in that case,
Yeah,
have a fine evening.
yeah, have a nice day. Yeah,
Yep. It's 2 p.m.
okay. Thank you again. Bye.
Later.